Right, here's a wee video about a lighthouse.
Before the turn of the 19th century, so many ships were being wrecked around the east coast of Scotland that the Lighthouse Commission, with the help of this man, decided that the elimination of the Bell Rock would be critical to drastically reduce the loss of life, cargo, and according to the British Navy, assist in the ever-expanding war with Napoleonic France. Now, according to the vast majority of sources, and Robert Stevenson himself, he was the man who campaigned for, designed and built the tower. But in actual fact, he only really assisted in these three campaigns, with it being John Smeaton's design, John Rennie being the chief architect, the stonemasons and the joiners and the template makers have been the ones who really built it. Now, because it was going to be out in the middle of the sea, Stevenson decided that granite would be the best material for the outer skin, and the inner skin was going to be built out of sandstone from the Craigleith quarry in Edinburgh, which is actually now a Sainsbury's. I believe also that they had sourced sandstone from Milnfield near Dundee. Now, granite is an igneous rock, meaning it's been boiled and spit out by a volcano, which means it's really, really hard, being sort of molten rock, which makes it absolutely perfect because it's impervious to water. It will not let any water in, so that was why he chose granite for the outer skin. Granite from Rubislaw Quarry in Aberdeen. Now, even though the sandstone would have been slightly softer, or quite a lot softer actually, than the granite, the Craigley sandstone is actually really, really hard. I've got quite a lot of experience working Craigley sandstone. I think Robert Stevenson and most of the masons would have had quite a lot of experience in working Craigley sandstone. It was a really good building material. I can actually still smell the dust now as I do this video. It has a sort of distinct smell different from other sandstones. It's got sort of like black veins through it, so I think we have sort of some organic material in the bed. It splits nicely down the bed. You can clearly see the bedding planes. It would have been a really easy stone to be picking for how you would need to lay the bed as you were building your courses in. So Craigleith to me is a perfect sandstone for this sort of building. The sad thing is that when I started researching this video, I was actually researching it because I wanted to try and find out the names of the guys, the masons, the blacksmiths, the joiners, or the guys that built the actual tower itself. But there was hardly any. But Stevenson did cast a few scenes in his notes. Here's one that I found particularly interesting. The surface of the rock was crowded with men, the two forges flaming, the one above the other. Upon the beacon, while the anvils thundered with the rebounding noise of the wooden supports, and formed a curious contrast with the occasional clamour of the surges. In the course of the forenoon, the beacon exhibited a still more extraordinary appearance than the rock had done in the morning. The sea being smooth, it seemed to be afloat upon the water, with a number of men supporting themselves in all the variety of attitudes and position, while from the upper part of this wooden house, the volumes of smoke which ascended from the forges gave the whole a very curious and fanciful appearance. Now, apparently Stevenson did muck in a bit. I doubt it. I think he probably sat in the office most days when it was getting a bit hard going, but it's my opinion. Now, during the season of 1807, a workers' barrack and a temporary beacon were to be constructed while Stevenson experimented with landing stones on the Bell Rock itself. And some accounts are saying that he tried to even, at high tide, wrap them in cork or put cork on the tops of the big blocks, float them, buoy them, and let it when they went down at low tide to land the stones on the rock itself, but that didn't really work. We'll get into that later. A captured Prussian vessel from the Napoleonic Wars called the Tong Gerrit was purchased to house a temporary floating light as the men built the temporary beacon and the light itself, the tower beacon, the Bell Rock Tower. But in the meanwhile, the Smeaton, a bit of an ode to John Smeaton, who the tower was sort of used as a design for, it was a ship built at Leith to house the 24 men it would take to fabricate the beacon barrack to house the real tradesmen, the stonemasons. Now, the stone cutters, joiners and mould makers would have came sort of from close by and from afar. They would have stayed in a sort of specifically built workman's barracks, making the stones for the tower and making the templates for the dovetail masonry. Now you can just imagine the scale of this place, because a huge 40-foot radius masonry platform was built in order to lay the stones dry so that there could be no mishaps on the rock itself. So when they got it out there, it had already been prefabricated, and therefore they could just sort of just plonk them in where they needed to be numbered and stuck in. Now by May 1808, these barracks housed 60 of the finest stonemasons, millwrights, joiners and labourers that Stevenson could find, with 10 masons brought in from Aberdeen from their experience for working in granite. Now I'm just going to leave you for a minute with Mr. Barry Hunt, who's a chartered geologist, surveyor and scientist whose expertise in stone conservation is unmatched. And I've asked him to just give a little comment on why granite is such an important building material for a lighthouse. Enjoy.
At the time of the lighthouse construction, geology was very much an infant science, finding its feet. We had to wait another 40 years before the development of microscopic techniques to be able to look at rocks and what makes them tick. Here, the crystals are interlocking. There is no space between them because all the crystals have grown within a molten material that's been crystallizing, and everything crystallizes out, leaving no space. There's no air there. That's what makes igneous rocks generally so good for building. Stone used in the construction of the lighthouse was Rubislaw granite, and I happen to have a piece of this. I collected at the quarry about 5 or 6 years ago. It's a relatively fine-grained granite, got great interlocking structure, and I can show you this structure down the microscope because I do have a slide. We have a lot of these dark crystals, and this is our biotite mica, a very common component of this. We actually have what we call a cross-hatched texture. This is known as tartan twinning, and it occurs on a mineral called microcline, which is a type of potassium feldspar, also known as an alkali feldspar, and it's these crystals again which form a major component of granite. Also present here, this bright crystal. I'll move a bit closer on this one. Very colourful. This is Muscovite mica, named after Moscow, where the Muscovites are, where they used to have some very, very large deposits of this mineral here. It's a very clear, flaky mineral, type of phyllosilicate, which is part of the sheet silicates. They come in sheets. So here we go, the Rubislaw granite. It is a true granite because there is a decent amount of potassium feldspar. There's a certain amount of plagioclase feldspar, which is the sodium calcium based one, which is more sodium rich. We also have a good proportion of quartz, and that gives us our typical granite chemistry. Our standard granite has a mixture of quartz, potassium feldspar and plagioclase feldspar. The micas are generally there for the ride, but they always seem to be there. One thing we notice about all these crystals is they interlock. This is the wonderful thing about thin section work. There is so much information that you can gather from looking at a rock section like this. There are times when some of these crystals, as you move around, you see they are much darker. And what this darkening is where it's starting to weather and change. Just going to zoom in a little bit of quartz at the center here. Here's a crystal of quartz. Quartz is silicon dioxide. It's a very strong hard mineral, 7 on Mohs scale. Very difficult to scratch even with a knife. And this is the binding heart of the granite. This material forms quite late on in the way that things are formed. It tends to lock everything together. The silica is the binding force of the granite more than the feldspar. It's a stronger, harder, more resistant mineral. It's the quartz that remains and ends up as sandstone. Most sandstones you look at have quartz in them. That brings us on nicely to why something like the Craigleith sandstone was a very good selection, because it was a sandstone, it's resistant to weathering in a variety of ways because it's near enough almost pure quartz. I don't have a thin section of the Craigleith sandstone, but this is from a very similar sequence and has similar structures and textures of sandstone. And immediately we see quite a difference here of these random grains. One thing we also see, this yellow everywhere. This is impregnating resin. We impregnate all samples with resin to see whether they've got voids in them, and this is shown up very nicely as to where the resin goes. It shows us where the voids are. It also shows us many other features as well in relation to micropores within certain components of the rock. Also grain boundaries, whether they're opening up under weathering. You can sometimes see resin going in and around all the grain boundaries. That shows it's starting to disaggregate. There's an awful lot we can tell from sandstones. So I zoom in more and more and more, you can see this granular structure here. Grain, 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 lots of different grains. They're what we call contacts, where the grains have started pushing into each other and recrystallize. And that actually sets them together. You get silica cement being formed under high straining pressures, which recrystallizes and locks everything together. The more this happens, the less the porosity becomes, the more locked together it becomes. And that's when we move into the realms of what we call quartzites, where all the quartz grains have partially recrystallized and locked together, and there's almost no porosity left. This is still a sandstone, a quartz-rich sandstone, but it's not quite a quartzite yet. But overall, mostly quartz grains, a bit of feldspar, a bit of mica. It's a granite that's broken down, created this rock. So when they used the Craigleith sandstone, they were likely using something like the Rubislaw granite from years ago that had broken down and formed Craigleith sandstone. And then that very stone, possibly derived from the Rubislaw granite, has also been used together with its parent rock.
Now, because Britain was at war in Europe, the guys on the lighthouse had to deal with what were called impressment gangs or press gangs, who would have been of His Majesty, and they would have gone around shore towns and stuff like that, pubs, and they were taking the workers from the pubs and chucking them onto ships to use in Nelson's navy. And because you would have thought, because it was a maritime safety issue to have this lighthouse being built, Robert Stevenson actually had to be writing letters to King and Country to try and get these guys off of the press gang service. Of course, in Stevenson's notes, he rarely talks about any issues with the guys. He talks about press gangs. He talks about there's actually instances of a strike. Typical guys, a few of them decided that they were going to strike because they weren't getting enough beer or food rations. So Stevenson decided that he'd pick the three worst offenders of this strike, or the three main leaders of the strike, and he got rid of them. And there was on the next shipment coming in to bring in rations and stuff, there was an extra 24 quarts of beer. So it just shows that Stevenson maybe actually did listen to the men a wee bit. And in this building season, the masons had built 1,300 tons of granite and it had risen over 30 feet. And as Robert returned to Arbroath, he wrote this in his diary also. Nothing can equal the happy manner in which these excellent workmen spend their time. While at the rock, between the tides, they amuse themselves in reading, fishing, music, playing cards, draughts, etc., or in sporting with one another. In the workyard at Arbroath, the young men were almost without exception employed in the evening at school, in writing and arithmetic, and not a few were learning architectural drawing, for which they had every convenience and facility. It therefore affords the most pleasing reflections to look back upon the pursuits of about 60 individuals who for years conducted themselves on all occasions in a sober and rational manner. Now, as I sort of touched on earlier, Stevenson had experimented with a few different ways of getting the stone onto the rock itself. And what he landed on, pardon the pun, was this railway. And he would have landed the stones on the least chaotic part of the rock and basically ferried them back and forward on this railway, which is, to me, just genius. Because of my trade, I feel like we have to use quite a lot of lifting appliances and stuff like that. So this is just a brilliant way to be doing it. Just nothing, no weight on your back or anything like that. You can just force it round, get it up into these, which are basically just old winches or hoists. There was no steam power, just manpower, and just pure and utter ingenuity. It just blows my mind how well they done this, really, to be honest. Now, at the start of the season of 1809, the rock was subject to some particularly harsh weather. And through this weather, no less than 10 of the stones had been dislodged from the tower itself, which, as you can imagine, created quite a scramble. But what was worse than that was that the railway had become dislodged and they'd had to fix the railway. So you can imagine coming back off, you've been away for a few months at a time, you've built this beautiful thing, you think you're coming back, it's still going to be sat there, and you get away, there's rock, there's stones being chucked away by the sea. Your means of transport for getting your stones from one point A to point B is gone. So you've got to then just kind of almost go back on yourself again. It must have been quite a slog for the guys. And I can kind of understand why they've asked for some more beer in their rations, to be honest. Now, this basically meant for the first 3 weeks of this building season, they had to be basically retrieving said stones and fixing the railway. Right, so they've got the railway, so now they can get it to the base of the tower. Now they have to get it up. And so Stevenson decided to make use of a balance crane as they went up. But as they got further and further up, they then had to do it in increments and re-sling it halfway up. That's why when you see in this picture that you have beams sticking out of the window there. So they would take it up, re-sling it, and then pull it up. And there was a couple of accidents with these balance beams. And this is where one of the principal builders, a Mr. Michael Wishart, was injured. Said to be bleeding profusely from a wound, and he was taken ashore thereafter. He was then subsequently taken on as a second-in-command lighthouse keeper for the Bell Rock after it opened. But also, on shore, a labourer under the name of William Walker was actually crushed by a stone in the yard in Arbroath, and he left behind a young family and a wife. So he was injured. Basically, a stone fell, crushed his thigh, and then he unfortunately died less than a week later. I touched on earlier that they had used porcelain and mortar, and basically they had used this thing called, they basically had made this rope ladder, and they called it Jacob's ladder. That went from the temporary beacon where they would have housed the men, and then to the Bellrock Tower. And so this was just a means of access, much like the railway that I just spoke about earlier. And they're just, so basically from the mortar gallery in the beacon tower to the tower itself, the mortar gallery, so they basically never had to take this down and up. So they just basically took the mortar tubs, they mixed it on a separate floor, and then they just used rope and pulley just to pull it over onto the tower. Right, I just want to say thanks if you got this far. And so I love history and I love work. I love my job. I love being a stonemason. I love teaching people, and I love doing these videos. So if there's any sort of like architectural delights, wonders of the world that you like, give me a comment and I'll see if I can find and do my wee video essays on any of the places that you guys are interested in, anywhere in your hometowns perhaps, and I'll see what I can find that would give me a good chance, an opportunity to learn and just bring my knowledge up. You can't get enough really, can you? So
Bye.